Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, depending on what side of the pond you're on, and welcome to an extra special edition of Across the Pitch. My name is Phil Kennedy, and I'm joined by co-host Tony Robinson today, where we have a man who is not just a man, but in fact a doctor, a real doctor on our podcast today. We have David Kilpatrick, who is a professor of English literature and sports management. He also is director of the sport program at Mercy College. Most importantly, he is the club historian for the New York Cosmos, which is what we're going to get into today. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kilpatrick.
Well, Phil and Tony, thank you both so much for having me on here. I'm really honored. Your podcast always has the greatest guests, and you have the greatest chats with them. So I'm quite chuffed to be asked. Thanks so much.
Well, it's our pleasure, and to be honest with you, it's just what you just said is what we try to accomplish. It's more of a chat as opposed to an interview. We like to just talk to our guests, and lots of times we'll go off in different tangents and that. But as long as we're talking about football, I think anything's fair game. But I'm certainly interested in talking about the Cosmos, as Phil mentioned. I mean, that's a name that really resonates around the world as far as club teams are concerned. So I'm looking forward to talking some history about that.
Sounds great. I think we have
it's an absolute
Accrington Stanley too, right?
It's an absolute honor to hear that you listen to and enjoy the show. It will definitely want to talk some Accrington Stanley with you. But before we before we get into the Cosmos, tell us a bit about your interest in Stanley. I understand that you ordered Darren's 50 Years of Accrington book, so that tells me you have quite an interest in the club.
Oh, yeah. Darren Woodhead's 50 Years of Accrington Stanley is really a great volume. Strong affinity with Accrington Stanley goes back to being a Yes fanatic. As you may well know, Jon Anderson grew up in Accrington, and his father ran the kind of like club pub, and that was the atmosphere that he grew up in. So being such a Yes fan, and in particular Jon Anderson fan, definitely had an affinity with them, and also find their story parallels that of the Cosmos really interestingly. And John's association through Yes with the Atlantic Records executive Ahmet Erdogan, who is also a Cosmos club president, kind of ties the knot there a little bit. And so I've had a couple conversations with John about that. Published as an interview a while back that was in the Stanley program. I'm not sure if you saw it, but yeah. So I always try to follow at least the score for Accrington Stanley, and on Stanley on.
You mentioned
you just said the catchphrase that we normally say at the end of the show. I was going to just jump in real quick and say we definitely need to get you over an Accrington Stanley Supporters Club of North America pin. And I did want to mention one thing that you touched on there was kind of the history of the club, because I was going through and kind of rereading through the history of the Cosmos myself, and a couple of dates kind of jumped out to me where it was like 1968 was kind of when it was decided that the team was coming up. 1970 is when the first matches were played. I was like, well, that sounds a lot like Accrington.
Yeah, I was actually born that year too, 1968. And again, Yes fans will know that band was formed then. So I can only imagine how John, whose dream as a child was to play for Accrington Stanley, how he felt. He just, signed to the big time and was on his way up, and back in his childhood home, that the club is revived. So yeah, the idea of a club kind of a rising phoenix like is a fascinating story. And of course, the commercial, who's that? It's just such a great story. And even though in some ways Accrington Stanley and the Cosmos were through the 70s and 80s certainly in very different universes, from a fan's perspective, the idea of knowing what it's like to lose something you love so much, and then working really hard to make it come back in whatever form that may be. It's a journey that both supporters groups have gone on. Stephen Mumford, the philosopher of sport aesthetics, a sport expert, in his book Watching Sport, he talks about Accrington Stanley in particular as being a case where it requires a conspiracy of the supporters to say, yes, this is the same team, this is the same club. There's continuity despite the lapse. And for Cosmos fans, that's something we can surely relate to, especially when, the haters try saying, oh, you're fake, you're not the real thing, it's not the same. And it's like, well, the heart's really what decides such things. And for fans of Accrington Stanley, they know the lapse and the resumption, and Cosmos fans the same. It can go away, but it never really fully goes away, and it can always come back. It's got a strong power. So both clubs have that legacy about them. It's something I find absolutely fascinating. And as a sport management faculty member, as a sports studies, soccer studies guy, I think that type of story of a club that just won't die is something that I find just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. You mentioned David about Jon Anderson, and he's obviously starting out in the music. And I remember when I lived in Accrington, he's quite a few years older than I was, but I do remember the name because at the time he was in a band called the Warriors.
Yeah.
And him and his brother, they actually made it to the top of the Pops, and that was a big thrill in the early 60s to see a band from Accrington on the top of the Pops. And then, as you said, in 68, they went on to form Yes. And you mentioned the pub. Would that be the Peel Park pub that his dad ran just across from the ground?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. From what John's told me, yeah, that's the way I take what he says, the way he calls it.
Yeah, that pub it's still going, and it's actually one of the top pubs in Accrington. And unfortunately, now it overlooks just a flat piece of grass where there's no evidence really of the old Peel Park grounds. And John would have been born not too far from there. I think he was on Norfolk Street, which is not too far from the ground.
He was also, he was a mascot there. He'd be retrieving the balls and stuff like that. Ball boy, mascot, the whole 9 yards. And apparently he was quite the footballer.
I do recall one of his last videos that he did about being happy or something along the name. And he had the Accrington Stanley scarf and the book Amazing Accrington and things like that. So he's still obviously proud of his roots and obviously proud of the Stanley Club.
Yeah, he follows them really closely. I think it's his brother's Tony, right?
Yes.
Still the season ticket holder. And so, he's always going back and forth with him. And I was the bearer of bad tidings a couple of years ago. I was backstage at a Anderson Pawnee Band show, post show, and gave him the news when the result didn't go the way we wanted. And his reaction was not what you expect from the angelic cosmic rock star. He really cares. He really cares.
Well, if he's from Accrington, usually people from the working class town of Accrington know a few colorful words.
Might have been a few of those said, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, we really wanted to kind of dial down on the Cosmos with you today because I just think it's such a unique story. And, for someone like me, I was born in 1981, which is kind of when soccer was reaching its end of its peak here. Of course, the original NASL folded in 85. So I just remember when I was, maybe 16 years old or so, and somebody told me, because this was like when the MLS was first starting up, and somebody told me, there was once a soccer league in the United States that used to sell out New York Giants Stadium. I didn't even believe it.
Yeah.
I mean, just where the sport has come and gone over the past 5 decades in this country is just unusual, to say the least. And the New York Cosmos are that team that, they've always kind of been there and come and gone as the sport is. And then right now, as somebody that, I'm a season ticket holder for Phoenix Rising. Obviously, we do this podcast. We follow U.S. soccer very closely. And it still took me about 15 minutes to explain to Tony what league New York Cosmos are in now, just because the football pyramid in this country is just so strange. And we thought that the best way to kind of start off would be by having you explain to us exactly how the American football pyramid breaks down and where the Cosmos are playing now.
That's a tough one. Okay, I'll try to put my professor's cap on with this because it's difficult to explain.
Obviously, we thought you would be the best person in the world to explain this.
Well, a couple episodes ago, you had that Seattle guy, wasn't it, talking about the different layers
yes,
that are really there in England, and he did such a good explanation of that. Yeah, you can't be so succinct and clear because we don't have a coherent system here in the United States in the absence of promotion and relegation. Instead, we have a system called professional league standards that have been put in place by U.S. Soccer. They keep changing. The bar keeps getting higher in some ways. And every time that bar gets higher, it works to the advantage of select few and at the disadvantage of all the rest. So the Cosmos in back in the heyday, 1968, that date that you set before is when the North American Soccer League, the original form of it started. As the first division sanctioned by United States Soccer. There was also the American Soccer League that was around that time. To what degree those leagues were rivals, but the success of the World Cup in '66 in England really provoked a lot of interest here in the United States. There had been a number of different things. In many ways, the golden age of soccer in the United States is back in the 1920s. And in other ways, sometimes I think the 1890s are the most fascinating era. But in '66, the interest in the World Cup really was able to get investors together. So in '67, there were actually two rival leagues, United Soccer Association, the National Professional Soccer League. The USA was sanctioned. NPSL was not. One league imported teams from other countries. So at Yankee Stadium, we actually had the New York Skyliners, who were, an imported team. And then we had the New York Generals, who were more local, but technically an outlaw team. Those leagues merged after the '67 season. So there was only one team then playing at Yankee Stadium in '68. So when I was born, and that was the New York Generals. They were owned by RKO General. But they only lasted that second year. And so then by 1970, there wasn't an ostensibly or there was no top flight team playing in New York, representing New York. Around that time, Neshui Erdogan and Ahmet Erdogan, the two brothers who ran Atlantic Records, they had sold the label to Warner Communications. Steve Ross, who ran Warner at the time, wanted to keep the Erdogan brothers involved with the record business. And he said, what would I have to do to keep you here? And they said, well, we want to own a soccer team. Well, the one brother was a Galatasaray fan. I think it was Ahmet. The other one, Neshui, was a Fenerbahce fan. So they didn't want to buy a team in Istanbul. So then they set about trying to figure out how they would go about owning a team. And they thought networking at the World Cup in Mexico in 1970 was a good idea. So they had a really big party down there attached to the World Cup. And a couple people kind of snuck their way into the party. And one of them was Phil Woosnam, who was trying to get the NASL going. And he said, since you guys are living in New York and since you guys are interested in owning a football club, why don't you just invest right there in New York? And by 1971, the Cosmos were competing in the North American Soccer League. 1981 is a little bit of a sore spot in that we made it to the championship, but lost after a shootout to the Chicago Sting in that championship game. But those are really great days. And as you say, we were selling out Giant Stadium. So a couple of years ago, the MLS Cup, they were bragging about this record attendance in Atlanta. But that wasn't as big as the attendance that we had at Giant Stadium when the Cosmos beat the Tampa Bay Rowdies in the Soccer Bowl 1978. So in many ways, a lot's happened since, say, the 94 World Cup. But in other ways, we still haven't reached the point that we had reached when I was a kid, when the Cosmos were really in their full glory, especially once Pele joined in 1975. That really started to really kindle the explosion of interest in soccer.
Tony,
So
I know you had a question regarding that. I think now would be a good time for that question you had, Tony.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's two things that stick in my mind as far as impact players in American soccer, and obviously Pele's the first one that really made an impact with the Cosmos, and then just a few years ago, David Beckham signed with the LA franchise in the MLS and made a big impact, and it's almost, and I think you've touched on this on sometimes about. People forget, they don't look back at the history of how things happened years ago. And, there was a fuss about Beckham being, such an impact. But out of the two, would you say Pele had a bigger impact on the soccer in the States or more than Beckham?
Oh, yeah, far and away. I think a few people who happened to be in an office in New York City were a little upset that I appeared on a Manchester United TV documentary a couple of years ago when they were doing their tour. And a lot of the initial thrust of the documentary was about the effect that Beckham had. But it was as if everybody had forgotten that Manchester United had been coming to the United States for quite a long time. They were a draw in New York, back in the 50s and whatnot. And that, Beckham had an impact, but it can't possibly compare to the impact that Pele had on my generation. There's just no means of comparison between the two. So yeah, things fell apart after 1984 for the NASL, but it was a revived attempt at it. My friend David Downs was named the commissioner of a revived North American Soccer League in 2011, and in late 2012, Eric Stover was named the COO of the revived Cosmos. The Cosmos never really totally went away, and that Pepe Penton, if you've seen the documentary Once in a Lifetime, he's kind of made to look, they kind of cast him as a bit of a fool, but he was rather savvy in that he preserved the intellectual property rights of the Cosmos as a soccer entity through all those years by protecting the intellectual property of the Cosmos and keeping it going as a soccer entity with offering soccer camps. The Cosmos, I was brought on board by Eric Stover as historian in November of 2012. And in 2013, we came back. It was like a dream come true. And at the time, the NASL, the revived NASL, was then sanctioned as second division. But we didn't really accept that. The sanctioned first division was the single entity Major League Soccer, which, again, I don't know how much your listeners, probably a lot of them know a lot about this in terms of what it means to be a franchise, operating as a franchise, rather than the more traditional club model that you find in Europe. But it was the highest level that we could be competing at. And somehow we wound up winning the title in 2013. Won a few more titles in the NASL, but things didn't exactly go the way we had planned back in 2012. In terms of a stadium project and things like that, had some obstacles in our path that maybe we didn't realize they would be quite so difficult to clear, to put it politely. And so found ourselves suddenly playing in a league that had been stripped of many of its entities for different reasons. Either they'd gone to MLS or to the USL, or folded under different pressures, competitions. Minnesota United, I know you give a lot of coverage to them. They were a club that was brought in by David Downs' daughter's college roommate was the owner of Minnesota United when they first came into NASL. They went to MLS as a franchise, but the shifts in organizational structure to make that happen, to buy into the single entity, very complex process that I think most fans, not only they not know about it, the more they learn about it, probably the less and less they care for it. That was certainly my opinion when Major League Soccer came into existence. It was October 17th, 95, I believe, it was when the original franchise names were announced. And while I was kind of hoping for the Cosmos to be, right back in the mix of it at Giant Stadium, instead we got the New York, New Jersey Metro Stars. And they, it wasn't the same, even though we had, Coach Fermani, and we had a great striker by the name of Giovanni Severisi. He ended up becoming the first head coach of the revived Cosmos in what we like to call the reboot era. But, after a few years of doing well there, suddenly we found ourselves playing in a league that was denied its second division sanction and told to go ahead and reapply. And it's been in the courts since. Obviously, the idea of being deprived, whatever, it's antitrust litigation that's battling in the courts now. But in the absence of whatever, Cosmos B played in the NPSL, did pretty well, fell a little bit short of the title to Miami. But now we're playing in NISA, the NISA, the National Independent Soccer Association. So the alphabet soup of American soccer leagues continues on, But, I use that line a lot, like, amnesia, antagonism, and apologetics. Those three A's tend to characterize the game here in America. We forget about our past. We battle between each other. And then we're always, making excuses for our failed performance. So myself and just about everybody at the Cosmos, I think I can speak for in this count. We think we can all do a lot better here in America, and that's really what we're struggling for.
You mentioned about the MLS, and I thought I read at some point, and maybe you could sort of clarify this for us, that the Cosmos had an opportunity to get into the MLS, but the MLS wouldn't recognize the history of the name. And apparently at the time, then that was a sort of a deal breaker, and they didn't become a member of the MLS. Am I on the right track there, or?
You're on the right track. I think it's more a matter. A guy named Paul Kimsley was the chief agent behind purchasing the Cosmos from Pepe Penton, whom I mentioned a few minutes ago. And I think he rather naively thought, Cosmos just belong at the top level. I'm here. We've got financial backing. Let's make this happen. And that's just not how it works in terms of MLS, right? You can't just say we're starting a club and we want to compete at the top level. So again, your interview with the guy from Seattle talked about what it means when a club has to reconstitute and kind of work its way back up. Rangers in Glasgow kind of had to go through a similar situation a few years ago again, where they were dropped out of the top tier for financial reasons and had to earn their way back up that ladder. That can't be achieved here in the United States. So I think he just kind of thought it would be there. So there are different price tags that have been thrown out there. Let's just say that the cost of a franchise fee, somewhere between $80 to $100 million. That's money that could have been invested in infrastructure that instead would just go to a franchise fee, which would mean essentially that you would hand over your intellectual property. So Kemsley's involvement kind of came to an end, and a new chairman, Seamus O'Brien, took over. And he was also involved with a TV network at the time called One World Sports. And, he, understanding calculated risk, thought we can do better here in the United States, and we need to shake up the system a little bit. Major League Soccer had been around for a while, and it's time to take the training wheels off, the training wheels of single entity that really, more than anything, suppress player wages, but kind of holds losses, to a minimum. And again, the great innovation of the current commissioner, Don Garber, was to create a spinoff of Soccer United Marketing, which in many ways tries to just control all soccer in the United States. But you can't really operate as a club that way. And so it's not that the history itself wouldn't have been acknowledged necessarily. That may be the case back in, say, 2012, early 2012, late 2011, I think, when those discussions were going on. I know when the Cosmos were first in negotiations for the NASL, they were allowed the clause of going to MLS, but the amount of money that it would have cost to join go a long way towards stadia and players and other things of that nature. And spending that much money to hand over your intellectual property rights
now I have
seem to make sense.
I have a quick question for you. This is slightly off topic, but kind of in the same ballpark of what we're talking about right now. Certainly, I'm sure that you're familiar with the NFL or the NBA model and how these are also obviously closed single entity leagues that obviously are very profitable, very successful, bring in the best players in the world. What makes soccer or football, depending on what you decide to call it, different, and why is it a better system for soccer to operate as it does in Europe as opposed to the way these other successful leagues operate in the U.S.?
Well, it essentially creates a pure meritocracy where, if you want to invest and you want to be the best, you've got an opportunity to rise. And again, professional league standards are in place in many countries. It's not that the very idea of professional league standards themselves are a problem, but when there's when fan ownership isn't even a possibility because the net worth of the individual owner has to be over a certain amount, right away the odds are stacked against you. And the territorial exclusivity that may come with that, the idea of players being signed, again, designated players are an exception to this now in the single entity, but the vast majority of players are signed by the league, not by the individual franchises. So when you look at sports like, we're seeing this right now in terms of the college football season, and people are talking about let them play or pay them to play or whatever it may be. College sport is massive in the United States, but it doesn't exist like that in the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm, right.
But the rest of the world, the top sport clubs don't have a draft where the lowest performing team gets to pick the best talent from around the country. Instead, you've got to have a youth program that develops talent, identifies talent, gets it ready for the top level, and works on that kind of more global economy. Major League Soccer is a little bit more on that North American franchise model, which really goes back to Major League Baseball and the antitrust exemption that baseball still enjoys, right? But with say college basketball, right? The debates. I teach at a Division II school, so there are some student athletes get scholarships, but at the big D1 schools, which whether it's football or basketball, where the sports are actually generating revenue for their institutions, but those players can't be paid. But in most states in the United States, the top employee, state employee is most often the head coach of either the football or the basketball team.
That's something that I've seen very frequently. I know that certainly here in the state of Arizona, we recently just had the legendary Lute Olson pass away, who is of course the longtime basketball coach at University of Arizona, and for many years he was the top paid state employee here, and certainly. That's something that you wouldn't see in any other country in the world. But just to play devil's advocate here, do you feel that in any way that the single entity closed system has in some ways, at least thus far, saved the MLS from the same fate as the original NASL?
Well, that's the argument they make in court. But no, I don't really buy into that. I think it's held things back. I could understand I understood the training wheels in the mid 90s when they were first put on. But from a New York fan perspective, I saw how that hampered operations really terribly for the Metro Stars and then eventually the Red Bulls, right? New Yorkers don't want to see a compromise in those ways. New Yorkers will come out for the best. And they proved that back in the Cosmos heyday. When we had Pele, Franz Beckenbauer, the list goes on of the great players, Carlos Alberto, Johan Cruyff played a couple games for us. We had, of course, Giorgio Chinaglia, Wim Reisbergen, Johan Neeskens. The list of the greatest players of that generation go on that wore the Cosmos shirt. And New York sports fans came out in droves for that. They come out when the top clubs around the world show up at MetLife Stadium or Yankee Stadium or Citi Field as well now. They still do, right? But they don't want to settle for something that's second best at a global level, to say the least, right? And that's where, again, what, you may call yourself a major league, but what does it mean to be truly major league? In Major League Baseball, they are the best players in the sport in the world. There are other leagues around the world that are really, really strong, like, for instance, Japan. And, some people have been watching South Korean baseball this season because it was one of the first ones that was back, right? But those leagues don't have the top talent. Major League Baseball does, unquestionably. NBA enjoys that hegemony despite the growth of basketball since the Dream Team in Barcelona.
Yeah, I think you're right on track with that, because I think that's a great comparison where the Japanese baseball league compared to Major League Baseball would probably be a similar comparison where MLS would be the Japanese baseball league in comparison to like the Premier League.
Yeah, so that's one thing that we realized, say from a Cosmos perspective, really quickly, is that certain people could deploy rhetoric very precisely. If they're talking to a North American audience, if you get labeled minor league, then that major league, minor league binary that gets into people's heads is really pretty strong. But when you're talking to a more global audience, then you say, oh, well, we're the first division and they're the second division, or now with NISA, the third division, right? The number one question I'd always get anytime I'd leave the country from 2012 on was, oh, you work with the Cosmos. When are you guys getting in the first division? And I have to explain, well, we don't really have a first division like in other countries where we can just earn it. So, 2013, we won the league. That didn't get us promotion. 2014, 2015, we repeat as champions. That doesn't earn us promotion. And then suddenly at the end of 2017, we find ourselves with no sanctioning whatsoever. And, the possibility of, again, Major League Soccer and Soccer United marketing, this is a well-known fact, actually made a bid to just buy out the intellectual property rights of the Cosmos. That wasn't to put them in as a franchise or to give that to NYCFC. We don't know if that would have been a kill fee or what they would have done with it. Just reduce it as a competitor. I don't know if the court case will bring that out, but it's a known fact that bid was made. It was that the Cosmos and what we stand for, not just in the New York area, but for the whole country, it is a threat to that model. So the question is the single entity model something that's good for the game? The WNBA started out with single entity, but they abandoned it rather quickly. So they're advocates for it, but I think ultimately it's an anti-competitive arrangement that does not really work to the benefit of the fans, certainly not the players whose wages are essentially restricted. So, yeah, I think we would do better to play the global game the way it's played globally.
Well, I think that's one of the things that when obviously we get listeners in the UK and some of the people, when I go over, they ask me, why isn't there promotion relegation? And then, as you say, you have to explain that there's a different system. So, I mean, it seems strange when you're talking to somebody, say at the Wham Stadium, and saying that you're a team like Cosmos won the championship, but they don't get rewarded with a promotion because, in essence, Stanley wouldn't be where they are today if it wasn't for being recognized for their success and moving up, where they could if they continued theoretically make it to the Premier League. Whereas in the States we don't have that system, and I always look at the MLS and say, is there a point where they can only expand? They can only go to so many markets. So at some point they're going to have to stop expansion. Would they ever go to a first division, second division, and have a relegation promotion between the two? Or is that something that the teams, the league wouldn't go for?
Well, I think, at the local level, I know a lot of our Cosmos fans tend to look at, the local MLS franchises, Red Bull and NYCFC, as rivals. And surely they are in a sporting sense. But when you look at the global engagement that Red Bull and City Football Group are doing, you see that they're happy to invest in systems where there's promotion relegation, and they exploit those systems to maximum advantage, whether it's Red Bull Leipzig or Manchester City, right? It's just two examples of the kind of lead clubs within those structures. So it could be that even within Major League Soccer, there are some entities that are more amenable and more open to a system that would allow for a pure meritocracy, that would allow them to just go and sign whomever they will without the league saying you can or can't do that. So, the thing is, too, other territories that are just completely outside of that orbit and don't ever have a chance for it, to always have to settle for being in an essentially minor league status seems to me antithetical to, we call it soccer because it's association football, right? We get that because of the football association, right? But clubs have to associate with one another. That's the very nature of it. You need to be associated. So to me, the very concept of an exclusive single entity is dissociative. So in some ways, it's almost like it's anti-soccer, isn't it?
Yeah, that's an excellent way to put it, and I never thought of it that way. But it just is a model that is really hard to explain when, as I say, you're sitting in a pub having a pint and explain it to people in Accrington that may not know the system. But is there any way that, because obviously there's various other leagues, the USL, and they have a championship, Division One and League Two. And with the NISL, is there any way that all these entities could come together to form a pyramid system that would rival the MLS and have such a thing as a Premier League championship, that type of a setup? Is that even remotely possible?
Well, that's certainly the model that some have been striving for and calling for and really working for. And I think that's, again, the threat to the hegemony. Right. The people that are in power never want to relinquish power just out of a sense of altruism. They have to really be compelled. So that's why it's important. If you're in Phoenix, support your local football club. Right. If you're in Omaha, pick which one is the best one to support and support it. Right. The more engagement we have and the more opportunities to support local football, that really breaks up this idea of artificial scarcity for franchises. My father grew up a Syracuse Nats basketball fan. They ended up becoming the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, the number one fan base for basketball in the United States, believe it or not, game by game attendance, it's not in the NBA. It's Syracuse University. So you can't really tell, Syracuse used to have an NBA team. They lost the NBA team to Philadelphia. Well, Philadelphia is a bigger market than Syracuse. There's no question. But more fans turn out for Syracuse basketball than they do to see the Sixers. So where's the logic in that? Why can't we have universities own their own professional sports teams, and maybe the players don't have to leave after 4 years? And maybe instead of the coach being the richest state employee, not that that's the case with Syracuse, they're a private institution, but maybe the coaches there could make something more comparable to an NBA salary. I bet NCAA coaches, probably many of them, if not most, at the top revenue generating schools, they probably make more money than their counterparts in the NBA or the NFL. That's because that's coming at the expense of their players, right? They're not getting that money. So what I'm talking about and what I want for soccer is the kind of paradigm shift that I'd like to see across the landscape with all sports in North America. I'd love to see Notre Dame play against the Giants, or for the Packers to take on the UCLA Bruins. I don't see why not. I'd love to see Syracuse play the Knicks. I think the Knicks could use that kind of kick in the pants so they can't just coast along. You have to compete, or else you suffer relegation. If there's a bad ownership group, I mean, a lot of criticism of what's going on out in Utah this past week, right? A lot of disgust. But people are going to profit from that. People aren't going to suffer from that. People are going to profit from that.
Right.
That's not the
what
model.
is it? Dale Loy Hansen, he's going to make money off of selling those teams. So, I mean, he can't own it anymore. But yeah, like you said, he's not getting punished. And you make a great point that kind of made me think of, and Tony, remember when we had Doug Irwin on and we were talking about the Greenville market, and I was kind of saying, well, would Greenville ever be able to support bigger than USL League One, which is third tier? And yeah, he's saying why not, and then you start thinking of Clemson football and how many fans they bring in. So you're absolutely right. There are a lot of markets in the U.S. Especially if it was the only game in town, and if it was truly a major world league, there's probably a lot of markets that could support a first division soccer team.
And aspirations, really fuel a fan base. And if you're told, okay, well, you can win this league, and then what happens? Well, you're back in the same league next year. That really, and you're told that's not as good as the other one, right? We have this with the NCAA too. Again, are you playing D1 ball or D2 ball or D3 ball? There's a lot of great athletes out there playing D3 ball just out of love for the sport and love for their institution. As soon as scholarships get involved, well, the love for the sport becomes a matter of, well, you're working for the sport, and the institution becomes more almost like an employer, right? Mm-hmm. So if you break up that whole model, right, what's going on in terms of amateurism in the college ranks, and then what's going on with the artificial scarcity of franchises in the professional leagues, we're really doing ourselves a great disservice. But sometimes you can be too close to the forest to see the trees. I know a lot of my colleagues in North American sport management circles really just don't even understand the club model. It can be really hard for people schooled on, the annual ritual of the NBA draft, or that bizarre lottery that is the NBA, the NBA draft and that lottery. I just don't understand it.
It's so funny that you mentioned that, because that was kind of one of the whole points of starting this show in the first place, is that we wanted to explain the European model to the American fan, and then really came to realize that more often than not, we were ending up explaining how strange the American model was to the European fan more than we were having to explain that the European model to the American fan. But yeah, I mean, if you really think about it, I mean, so there's 92 league clubs in England, which is a country of, I think, about 65 million. Yeah, so why could there not be 92 professional clubs in a country of 350 million?
Yeah, we just make it too difficult. And if you're a player with aspirations, you know that your opportunities are few and far between here. You're really up against it. And unless you qualify for dual citizenship, boy, it's really tough to break through the EU or the UK. Much harder than it is for, say, again, if you're a player in Brazil and you've got some promise, well, you can qualify through the Portuguese passport for the European status, right? You've got that built in terms of that kind of reciprocity with Brazil and Portugal. That you just do not have as somebody who's just an American citizen. So it can be really difficult to make it at all here. And when the opportunities at the top level are so few, and there's, we've got so many clubs that only are around for a year or two, and then poof, they disappear. So what constitutes longevity with this American soccer club? Gosh, it's 3 years is a tremendous success, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one other thing that I wanted to kind of circle back to that we didn't talk about earlier with the Cosmos, and this was something that I wanted to kind of get your opinion on, is what is it that's preventing the Cosmos from either joining or wanting to join the USL Championship? Is it just the USL's ties to the MLS in general, or what's the story on that?
It seems to me, from what I understand, that it's simply not an option, and that for on both sides, I think that they're probably, my understanding is not exactly welcome, but also the nature of USL's, say the way they handle intellectual property rights and things like that, just doesn't work for an entity that's trying to be more of a club in the global sense. So my understanding is that right now that's just not a possibility, and I think that has to do with their structure, and to what degree that may be a matter of their strong partnership with MLS. Beyond that, I would have to kind of just leave it at that. I'd say I just don't think it's a possibility right now.
So I'm assuming that it's pretty much without having to go into it too deeply. Is it essentially the USL's partnership with the MLS is what led to the NASL losing its second division status?
Well, again, this is being played out in the courts, right? But when did USL go up from third division to second division status, and when did we have our status revoked? Timing isn't necessarily causation, right? Mm. But again, the adaptations of the professional league standards have benefited certain organizations at certain times, and then other organizations have been given exemptions, and then clearly we were denied whatever exemption, right? The initial plea in court was just a stay of execution, if you will, to just allow the NASL to have second division status while we kind of worked this out. But we were denied that. So when you're trying to have sponsors like Emirates Airlines, which, they were our sponsor, in 2013 through 2017, along with Real Madrid, Arsenal, Paris Saint-Germain, I think Hamburg, and who am I leaving out that were sponsored?
Yeah, as big a sponsor as there is in the sport.
Yeah, that's right. And so, we had their brand on our shirt like those other top clubs did. That's a tough argument to make when you're being labeled second division. But when you have, clearly greater aspirations for that, okay. But when that second division status has been revoked, where does that leave you, right? When you're not even sure if you have a league, when you're not sure what the status of that league would be, that makes competing for competing for space in the media. Again, the way in which the Cosmos were covered when I was a kid, and the way in which even the Major League Soccer franchises are covered right now. But try to get coverage for the Cosmos. Raul played his last game as a professional in the championship game for the Cosmos. It didn't get any coverage from newspapers beyond El Diario and the Daily News. New York Times ignored it. New York Post ignored it. Most TV stations ignored it. This is one of the greatest players in soccer history going out as a champion. And along with him, Marcus Sena, right? And that didn't get the local coverage. So whether it's global sponsorships or local media attention, when you are being deprived the right to compete, to be the top, you're being held back, you're being hampered. And again, I think the record shows whatever in terms of, lobbying dollars in Albany, what was the largest lobbyist group in Albany certain years. These are all well-documented things. What were they lobbying? Why did we not get the stadium that we had hoped for? Different things like that really made us feel like we were very much up against it. And so it's kind of ironic, I think, for the big bad Cosmos to be playing the role of David to Goliath, but that's kind of how we find ourselves right now. Fortunately, David's got one heck of a slingshot in the form of Rocco Commisso, who's the chairman of the Cosmos now. He's the owner of Fiorentina as well, but he's got the resources to kind of walk the walk to go along with the talk that he's talked, and that's where we're at now in terms of trying to battle not just what's best for the Cosmos. I think a lot of people misunderstand and think, oh, the Cosmos just want their way into MLS without paying that initiation fee. That's not the case at all. That is definitely not the case. And believe it or not, the Cosmos are operating in more of an altruistic sense of trying to provide opportunities for everyone in a fair, equitable, open system that's more aligned with the sporting integrity statutes that FIFA has itself.
You mentioned earlier about the life expectancy of a professional team in the States, and you mentioned around that 3 to 4 years. I mean that's staggering when you look at the system in England, where teams very rarely go out of business in the football pyramid. When I say that, you've got Bury that went out of the league, although they're still in existence. They were expelled from the EFL. Is it because of the fact that the nature of the system in the States where a league is established, and then if it doesn't get traction, or you just have a dozen or so teams playing against each other, and then it just wears out, and then would the promotion relegation kind of help leagues and teams extend their life expectancy?
Well, if you look, Accrington Stanley is a great example of a club rising phoenix-like from the ashes, as they say. And Stefan Zemanski and Simon Cooper in their book Socceronomics really make that argument that in other systems, clubs really can't die. They may go into insolvency, but they can be revived. Very often with the same colors and iconography and embracing the legacy. Again, I mentioned Mumford's Watching Sport. It almost takes that conspiracy in some ways for some fans to say, yes, this is that. But the artificial scarcity of franchises here allows owners to play municipalities against one another. In many ways, the real battle, the real competition between major league franchises in North America is one municipality against another. So, if you're operating a sport entity in Pittsburgh, that you're always going to be playing around with the idea of like, well, you better give us a nicer stadium here coming up, or else we just might move to Vegas, right? I guess the NHL franchises can't threaten to move to Vegas anymore, can they?
No, not with no. Or Seattle.
But yeah,
exactly. Seattle was the next one now, and I think Houston's probably the next one now.
Yeah, so the idea of always threatening to go somewhere else if you don't get that deal. You can only do that if there's a closed system where there's artificial scarcity. If the system opens up, well, that cash cow goes. So, Major League Soccer, they can now use the argument of, oh, well, these franchise fees, not only the franchise fees, which have only mushroomed very recently, right? When Anschutz Entertainment Group owned the Metro Stars, they couldn't find a buyer for the longest time. Red Bull GmbH came along, and they really wanted to be the second franchise in New York and play out in Queens. But then, they really got pushed into taking on AEG, and then got kind of pushed into the Harrison Project, etc. And they are what they are, but they don't really have a big incentive to invest like they do in Salzburg, or certainly not at the scale they do in Leipzig. Not right now, right? But if they wanted to renegotiate with the municipality, and municipal bonds now is really the big way of then being able to say to politicians, hey, the Columbus Crew example, right? Look what was going on with the Save the Crew movement. Then people really realized in Cascadia, the whole idea of trying to trademark the Cascadia Cup and own the intellectual property rights to that thing that had grown rather organically. The Save the Crew movement, they realized, hey, if an owner wants to move to Austin, Texas, he can go ahead and do that. Now, if you were a fan of the San Antonio club that left the NASL for the USL under the assumption that they were going to be the ones to get the next franchise in Texas, I'm sure people in San Antonio are still pretty ticked off about what's going on down the road in Austin. But why can't they both have teams playing at the top level if they have the infrastructure to compete at the top level?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, it's really a unique thing that you have here that you don't really see in other countries whatsoever. And it's like you said, it's why can't there, for instance, be an NBA team in Pittsburgh when it supports the other three sports? It's just like you said, you kind of hit the nail on the head, where it's created scarcity where the scarcity doesn't really need to be there, because there's probably 150 cities out there that could support a team if they were at the top level.
Well, I like the idea that you had before of crossing over. Who wouldn't want to see Clemson play the Carolina Panthers? That would be something. So things like that are something that I think people it should be explored. But certainly, I think we've. I don't know if we've clarified the pyramid system in the States, but we certainly. We've certainly gone and explored a lot of it today, and it's been a real pleasure spending some time with you, David, today.
Well, I really, really enjoyed talking with you both. So Phil and Tony, thanks so much for having me on. And like I said before, I enjoy your podcast very much. It's so informational and so conversational. So you look back at the people you've had on the show. I'm really quite honored to be in such great company. So thanks so much for having me on.
Our pleasure.
Well, we're honored not only to have you on the show, but even more honored to hear that you listen to and enjoy the show. And it's been a fantastic conversation, and we will definitely have to do it again in the future, perhaps talk some more on Accrington. But it's been just incredible hearing all of the details of the history of the Cosmos, and we wish all of the best luck to the club moving forward. And what you're saying, it really kind of hits the nail on the head about what's wrong with the system over here, I think.
Well, thanks so much. Really fun chatting, and look forward to chatting again sometime soon.
Thank you, David.
Cheers, and let's give it. You said it earlier, but let's finish up. On Stanley on.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.